Inside the Monday morning coffee shop, the grinder screamed louder than conversation. A blonde woman in a red coat stepped to the counter, hands moving in careful gestures, but the barista just smirked. "If you can't talk, maybe you shouldn't order." No one moved to help. Then a man in a worn apron walked forward, his hand signing to the little girl beside him before turning to the woman. In that moment, her eyes brightened. He smiled. "Oat milk latte, right?" She placed a business card on the counter. Vivian Rhodes, CEO, Auralist Technologies. He froze. That company had taken away the person he loved most in this world. Daniel Brooks was 36 years old, and every morning he woke to the sound of silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that came after something beautiful had been ripped away. 3 years ago, he had been a software engineer specializing in artificial intelligence. He had worked on systems that predicted traffic patterns, analyzed data streams, helped machines understand human behavior. His wife Rachel had worked beside him in the industry, brilliant and passionate about making technology safer. They had shared a small house in the suburbs with their daughter Sophie, who was born deaf but whose laughter filled every room anyway. Then came the accident. A self-driving car, manufactured by Auralist Technologies, had malfunctioned on a rainy highway. The vehicle's software failed to detect the stopped traffic ahead. Rachel had been crossing the street with groceries. She never had a chance. The lawsuit Daniel filed was dismissed. The evidence disappeared. The company's lawyers were too powerful, their resources infinite, compared to his grief. He lost his job when he became too vocal about corporate accountability. He lost the house when the legal fees drained their savings. All he had left was Sophie, and a rage so deep it had nowhere to go but inward. Now he worked the night shift at Seattle Brews, a small café downtown where the tips were decent and the questions were few. He lived in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the heating barely worked and the walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing. But Sophie's drawings covered every surface: crayon landscapes, finger-painted sunsets, a child's vision of color in a world that had gone gray. Every evening before his shift, Daniel would count the cash in the kitchen drawer. Rent was due in 12 days. Sophie's tuition at the special school for deaf children was due in 15. He picked up extra shifts, fixing cars at a garage on weekends, coming home with oil under his fingernails and exhaustion in his bones. On his wrist, he wore a silver bracelet engraved with 5 words. "Listen with your heart." Rachel had given it to him on his last birthday before she died, back when they still believed the world was fair and good people were rewarded. He never took it off, even when the metal grew warm from his pulse. If he lost this job at the café, there would be no backup plan, no savings account, no family to call. Just him and Sophie, against a city that had already proven it didn't care. He told himself that if they could just make it through winter, things would get better. Spring always felt like possibility, but fate had other plans. It was raining the morning Vivian Rhodes walked into Seattle Brews. Not the soft drizzle Seattle was famous for, but a cold, punishing downpour that sent people rushing inside with soaked coats and irritation on their faces. She stood out immediately, tall, composed, wearing a tailored red coat that looked expensive even under the fluorescent lights. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat twist, and she wore a small hearing aid tucked behind her left ear, subtle but visible if you knew what to look for. Her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of face people wore when they had learned not to expect kindness. She approached the counter and began signing. Her hands moved with precision, asking for a latte with oat milk, no sugar. The barista, a young guy named Tyler who worked mornings, just stared at her blankly. Then he laughed. "Lady, I don't know what you're doing, but if you can't talk, maybe you shouldn't order." A few customers nearby chuckled. One woman whispered to her friend. Vivian's face didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that looked like resignation, like this had happened before and would happen again. Daniel was wiping down tables in the corner, Sophie beside him with her backpack, waiting for him to finish so he could walk her to school. His daughter tugged his sleeve, her small hands moving rapidly. "She's like me, Dad." He looked up, saw the woman at the counter, saw the hearing aid, saw the way she held herself with dignity, even as people laughed, and something in him broke open. He walked over, his hands already moving as he approached. "What would you like?" Vivian's head snapped toward him, eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, she didn't respond, as if she couldn't believe someone had actually signed to her. Then her hands moved, careful and grateful. "Oat milk latte. No sugar. Please." Daniel turned to Tyler. "Oat milk latte. No sugar." Tyler's smirk faded. He rang it up without another word. While they waited, Sophie stepped closer to the woman, her hands moving with the fearless honesty of children. "You're beautiful." Vivian blinked rapidly. Then she smiled. A real smile. The kind that reached her eyes and softened the edges of her face. She knelt down to Sophie's level and signed back. "So are you." A single tear rolled down Vivian's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, like she wasn't used to crying in public. But Daniel saw it. Saw the loneliness in that single gesture of being understood. When the latte was ready, Vivian reached into her coat and pulled out a business card. She placed it on the counter in front of Daniel, then signed thank you before walking out into the rain. Daniel picked up the card. Vivian Rhodes, Chief Executive Officer, Oralis Technologies. The room tilted. That name, that company, the one that had buried the truth about his wife's death. The one that had lawyers delete emails and pay off witnesses. The one that had walked away clean while he buried Rachel in the rain. Sophie was tugging his sleeve again, asking what was wrong. But Daniel couldn't move. He just stared at the card, the glossy logo catching the light, mocking him. Vivian Rhodes had lost her hearing when she was 10 years old. She remembered the explosion, the sharp, terrible sound that came before the silence. Her mother, Elaine Rhodes, had been a chemical engineer working late in the laboratory. Vivian had been visiting after school, sitting in the corner doing homework, when the reaction went wrong. The blast killed her mother instantly. It shattered Vivian's eardrum and damaged the nerves in her left ear beyond repair. She spent weeks in the hospital learning that the world would never sound the same again, and her father, Gregory Rhodes, founder of Oralis Technologies, spent those weeks teaching her a different lesson. Power is the only voice people respect. Gregory raised his daughter to be untouchable, to never show weakness, to use wealth and control as armor against a world that would otherwise see her as less. Vivian learned sign language in private, but refused to use it in public. She wore hearing aids that cost thousands of dollars, and spoke with perfect enunciation, so no one would guess what she'd lost. She built walls so high that even she forgot what it felt like to be vulnerable. By the time she inherited Oralis at 30, she was exactly what her father had designed. A CEO who never apologized. A woman who commanded rooms with silence more than words. Someone who believed that if you showed compassion, people would take advantage. But loneliness had a way of seeping through even the thickest armor. At night, in her sterile penthouse overlooking the city, Vivian would take off her hearing aids and sit in the dark. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was just empty. Daniel's story was different, but the wounds were the same. Rachel Brooks had been a programmer at Oralis Technologies, working on the autonomous vehicle division. She had been the one to discover the flaw in the navigation software. A critical error that caused the system to miscalculate stopping distances in wet conditions. She had documented it, sent reports to her supervisor, demanded they delay the vehicle launch until the issue was fixed. Her supervisor was Marcus Hale, Oralis's chief operating officer, a man who measured success in quarterly earnings and market share. He told Rachel the data was inconclusive, that the launch schedule couldn't be delayed, that she was being overly cautious. When she threatened to go over his head, he reassigned her to a different project and buried her reports in a server no one checked. 4 months later, the vehicle's software failed. Rachel was killed. Marcus had her employment records scrubbed clean. He made sure the internal emails never surfaced in Discovery. He paid off the right people, and the lawsuit collapsed before it ever saw a courtroom. Daniel was left with a daughter to raise and a heart full of rage he had nowhere to put. He tried to keep working, but the anger followed him into meetings, into code reviews, into every interaction, until his employers decided he was too much of a liability. So he disappeared into low-wage work where no one asked questions and no one expected anything. Sophie grew up knowing her mother only through photographs and stories. She would touch the pictures, tracing her mother's face, and Daniel would tell her about the woman who had wanted to make the world safer, the woman who had tried to speak up, the woman who had been silenced. Now, 3 years later, the CEO of the company that killed his wife had walked into his café and smiled at his daughter. The universe had a cruel sense of irony. 2 days later, Vivian came back. Daniel was restocking cups behind the counter when she walked in, this time without the red coat. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, looking almost like anyone else except for the way she carried herself, like she was used to being in charge even when she wasn't trying to be. She walked directly to him and placed an envelope on the counter. Inside was a handwritten note and an invitation to Auralist Technologies. We're developing an AI system to translate sign language into voice in real time. I need someone who understands silence. Someone who knows what it means when the world doesn't listen. I'd like to offer you a consulting position, flexible hours, competitive pay, and a chance to build something that matters. Daniel stared at the note, his jaw tight. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to crumple the paper and throw it back, to tell her he wanted nothing to do with the company that had destroyed his life. But then Sophie appeared beside him, her school bag bouncing on her shoulders. She was early. He had asked a neighbor to bring her by after school. The girl looked at Vivian, then at the note, then back at her father. Her small hands moved with careful deliberation. "Dad, maybe this time you can fix what hurt us." The words hit him like a punch. Sophie was 7 years old and already wise enough to see what he couldn't. That anger wouldn't bring Rachel back. That hiding wouldn't change the past. That maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for that didn't involve revenge. He looked at Vivian. She met his gaze steadily, waiting. He nodded once. "I'll come in next week." Vivian's shoulders dropped slightly, a relief she didn't try to hide. She signed to Sophie. "Your dad is very brave." Sophie grinned and signed back. "I know." The Auralist Technologies building was exactly as Daniel remembered from the news coverage during the lawsuit. Glass and steel, towering over downtown Seattle like a monument to progress. Inside, the lobby was all marble floors and LED screens displaying stock prices and company achievements. People in expensive suits moved through the space with the confidence of those who knew they were winning. Daniel felt out of place immediately. His jeans were worn, his jacket frayed at the cuffs. Sophie held his hand tightly, her eyes wide as she took in the gleaming surfaces and the hum of voices echoing off the high ceilings. Vivian met them at the elevator. She had returned to her CEO uniform, tailored blazer, sharp heels, hair pulled back. But when she saw Sophie, her expression softened. She knelt down and signed. "I'm glad you came." Sophie signed back. "This place is big. Do you own all of it?" Vivian smiled. "I'm in charge of it." "That's different." They rode the elevator to the 15th floor, where the AI research lab occupied an entire wing. Vivian had set aside a private room for Daniel and Sophie, equipped with computers, whiteboards, and a corner filled with books and toys for the girl to occupy herself while her father worked. The other employees watched Daniel with curiosity and suspicion. He could feel their eyes following him down the hallways, hear the whispered questions. Who is he? Why is he here? Is he really qualified? But Vivian made it clear. This man is a consultant on our most important project. He has expertise we need. Treat him with respect. Daniel spent the first week reviewing the AI system's code, analyzing the sign language recognition algorithms, testing the translation accuracy. The work was familiar, pulling him back into the world he had left behind. And despite everything, despite his anger and grief, he found himself caring about the project, about building something that could help people like Sophie, like Vivian, like everyone who had ever been ignored because the world couldn't be bothered to listen. Vivian would stop by the lab each afternoon, checking progress, asking questions. Their conversations were a mix of spoken words and signed phrases, slipping naturally between the two. Daniel noticed how she relaxed when she signed, like she was allowed to be herself instead of the persona she wore in boardrooms. Sophie became a fixture in the office, charming the staff with her drawings and her fearless use of sign language. She would sit in meetings, coloring quietly, occasionally signing questions that made the engineers laugh. What's an algorithm? Why do computers need to learn? Can they dream? Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, exactly, but maybe the edge of it. The possibility that life could be more than just survival. And then Marcus Hale found out. Marcus Hale was 40 years old. Tall and lean with slick-back blonde hair and eyes the color of old ice. He wore custom suits and a diamond-studded watch that cost more than most people's cars. He had been with Aurelius for 15 years, climbing the ladder through calculated decisions and strategic ruthlessness. When he heard that Vivian had hired a consultant without board approval, and that the consultant was Daniel Brooks, he didn't bother hiding his contempt. He found Daniel in the lab one afternoon, Sophie at the table drawing while her father worked. Marcus walked in without knocking, his presence filling the room like cold air. "You think your sob story earned you a seat at this table?" Daniel turned slowly. He had seen Marcus's face before, in depositions and news articles. The man who had killed his wife through negligence, and then covered it up with money. "I was invited," Daniel said quietly. Marcus stepped closer. "You're a washed-up engineer who couldn't hack it in the real world. And now you're here, playing house with the CEO, using your deaf kid as a sympathy card." Sophie looked up, sensing the tension even if she couldn't hear the words. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "My daughter has nothing to do with this, doesn't she?" Marcus smiled, thin and sharp. "Vivian has a weakness for charity cases. But this company doesn't run on feelings. It runs on results. And you? You're just another liability, waiting to happen." He left without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind him. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his apartment, listening to Sophie's breathing from the next room, thinking about Marcus's words. Charity case. Liability. The same words that had followed him since Rachel died. The same assumptions that people made when they saw a single father struggling to keep his head above water. But there was something else nagging at him. Something Marcus had said that didn't sit right. This company doesn't run on feelings. As if emotions were weakness. As if caring about people was a flaw instead of the whole point. Daniel got out of bed and opened his laptop. He still had access to Aurelius's internal network from his consulting work. He started searching, following threads of code and file structures, looking for anything that felt wrong. 3 hours later, he found it. Hidden in an archived server marked H drive, there were logs from 3 years ago, vehicle diagnostics, error reports, and a chain of emails between Rachel Brooks and Marcus Hale. Rachel's warnings, Marcus's dismissals. And then, after the accident, a final note. "Bury this. No traces. M.H." Daniel's hands shook as he downloaded the files. This was it. The evidence that had been erased. The proof that Marcus had known about the flaw and ignored it. That Rachel had died because one man cared more about profits than safety. He needed to show Vivian. But as he stared at the files, a cold fear settled in his chest. Marcus was powerful. He had buried this once. He could do it again. And this time, Daniel had more to lose. He had Sophie to protect. In the morning, Daniel went to Vivian's office. She was standing by the window, looking out at the city, and she turned when he entered. Her face was calm, but her eyes were tired, like she hadn't slept either. "I found something," he said. He showed her the files, the emails, Rachel's reports, Marcus's cover-up. Vivian read through everything in silence, her expression growing harder with each page. When she finished, she looked at Daniel with something that might have been guilt or grief, or both. "My father knew," she said quietly. He told Marcus to handle it quietly. To protect the company's reputation. I didn't know the details, but I knew something had been buried. I've always known. Daniel felt his anger rise. "And you did nothing?" "I was 29 years old and terrified of disappointing my father," Vivian said, her voice breaking. "I've spent my whole life being what he wanted me to be, and I've hated myself for it every single day." She turned away, wiping her eyes quickly. "I can't fix what happened. I can't bring your wife back, but I can make sure Marcus doesn't get away with this again." "He'll destroy us," Daniel said. "He has the board. He has the lawyers. Then we'll fight smarter." Vivian looked at him, and for the first time, Daniel saw not a CEO, but a woman who was just as tired of lying as he was. "We'll expose him. Publicly. In a way he can't cover up." They spent the next 2 weeks building their case. Daniel worked late into the nights, cross-referencing the files, finding every connection between Marcus's decisions and the vehicle failures. Vivian reached out to journalists, to investigators, to anyone who might help them bring the truth to light. But Marcus wasn't stupid. He had eyes everywhere in the company. And when he realized what they were doing, he moved fast. First came the rumors. Whispers that Vivian was sleeping with a subordinate, that she was compromised, that her judgment couldn't be trusted. The board members started asking questions. Shareholders expressed concerns. Marcus played the role of the loyal COO, expressing sadness at Vivian's poor decisions, suggesting maybe she needed time away to clear her head. Then came the ultimatum. A closed-door meeting with the board. Vivian was given a choice: step down temporarily and let Marcus take over as interim CEO, or face a vote of no confidence that would remove her permanently. She refused, and they voted her out anyway. The same day, Daniel was escorted from the building by security. His access was revoked. His consulting contract terminated. The official reason was misuse of company resources. The real reason was that Marcus wanted him gone. Daniel picked up Sophie from the daycare on the ground floor, his hands shaking as he signed to her. "We're going home." She looked at him with wide eyes. "Did we do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart. We tried to do something right, and sometimes that's worse." That night, Vivian sat in her penthouse apartment, the city lights glittering below. She had removed her hearing aids, letting the silence settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had lost. Marcus had won, and the company her father built would continue to prioritize profit over people. She thought about Daniel, about Sophie, about all the people like Rachel, who had tried to speak up and been silenced. And she thought about the woman she had become. Cold, controlled, complicit. She had spent so long building walls that she had forgotten how to be human. It was Sophie who changed everything. 3 days after Daniel was fired, the little girl was helping him pack up the apartment. They couldn't afford to stay. He had found a cheaper place across town, smaller and colder, but it was what they could manage. Sophie was going through her mother's old boxes, looking at photographs and trinkets, when she found something Daniel had forgotten existed. A USB drive, tucked inside an envelope, marked for Daniel. He plugged it into his laptop, and Rachel's face appeared on the screen. She had recorded a video 3 days before she died. Her expression was serious, her eyes tired, but determined. "Daniel, if you're watching this, it means something went wrong. I've been documenting everything about the vehicle flaw. Marcus keeps shutting me down, but I need this on record. I'm uploading all the test footage here, the failed simulations, the warning signs, everything." The video cut to dashcam footage from a test vehicle. Rain, a highway. The car approaching stopped traffic too fast. Rachel's voice in the background, urgent and frightened. "Marcus, the override's failing. Shut it down." But the car didn't stop. It slammed into the barrier at full speed. The screen went black. Daniel sat frozen, tears streaming down his face. Rachel had known. She had tried, and she had left evidence behind, because she knew Marcus would try to erase her. Sophie touched his arm, her hands moving gently. Mom wanted to tell the truth. Daniel looked at his daughter. 7 years old, and already braver than he had ever been. He picked up his phone and called Vivian. She arrived at his apartment an hour later, still dressed in the clothes she had been wearing for 2 days, her hair loose and her face exhausted. Daniel showed her the video. She watched it 3 times, her expression hardening with each replay. "We can use this," she said. "Marcus will bury it like he buried everything else. Not if we go public. Not if we show it to everyone at once." Vivian pulled out her phone and started making calls. journalists, tech reporters, anyone who would listen. And then, she made one more call. To the FBI. 2 federal agents arrived the next morning. They took copies of the files. They interviewed Daniel. They reviewed the H-Drive logs. And they opened an official investigation into Auralis Technologies for corporate fraud and negligent homicide. Marcus tried to spin it. Tried to claim the files were fabricated. But the video couldn't be faked. Rachel's voice. The timestamps. The metadata. It was all there. The annual shareholders' meeting was in 5 days. Vivian had been barred from attending, but she had one card left to play. A public speech, in front of investors, media, and everyone who had ever doubted her. She asked Daniel to stand with her. He agreed. The conference hall was packed. Shareholders filled the seats. Journalists lined the walls. Cameras tracked every movement on stage. Marcus stood at the podium, delivering his prepared remarks about innovation and growth, and Auralis's bright future. Then Vivian walked in. Security tried to stop her, but she kept walking. Daniel and Sophie behind her. The crowd murmured. Marcus's smile froze. Vivian stepped onto the stage and removed her hearing aids. She set them on the podium with a soft click that the microphone caught. Then she began to sign. The room fell silent, confused. But behind her, the massive screen flickered to life. The AI translation system they had built together, the one Daniel had coded and Vivian had funded, began to translate her signs into spoken words that filled the hall. This company silenced truth. Today, silence speaks back. The screen shifted. Rachel's video played. Her warnings. The test footage. The crash. Marcus's voice telling her. The data didn't matter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Marcus tried to speak, but the FBI agents, who had been waiting in the back row, moved forward. They placed handcuffs on his wrists in front of hundreds of witnesses. Marcus Hale, you're under arrest for fraud, obstruction of justice, and criminal negligence. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Shareholders stood. But Vivian just kept signing. Her hands steady, even as tears ran down her face. Rachel Brooks tried to save lives. She was silenced. Today, I'm giving her back her voice. Daniel stood beside her, Sophie's hand in his, watching as the man who killed his wife was led away. It wasn't peace. It wasn't healing. But it was justice. Finally, the fallout was swift. Marcus was formally charged. The board launched an internal investigation. Dozens of executives were found complicit in the cover-up. Some resigned. Others were fired. The company's stock plummeted, and Auralis Technologies faced lawsuits from victims' families across the country. But Vivian didn't walk away. She fought to rebuild. She took back control as CEO, this time without her father's shadow hanging over her. And the first thing she did was establish the Rachel Brooks Foundation, a fund dedicated to technology ethics, whistleblower protection, and support for families affected by corporate negligence. Daniel was named the foundation's technical director. He worked with engineers, policymakers, and advocates to create new standards for AI safety. Real standards. Ones that put people before profits. And Sophie became the face of Auralis's new mission. She appeared in promotional materials, her bright smile and fearless use of sign language showing the world what inclusion actually looked like. The company built accessibility into everything they designed. Deaf and hard-of-hearing consultants were brought onto every project. The AI translation system they had built became open source, free for anyone to use. 6 months after the trial, Sophie had her cochlear implant surgery. The procedure was covered by the foundation, along with years of therapy and support. Daniel held her hand in the recovery room, waiting for the moment when the device would be activated. When the audiologist turned it on, Sophie's eyes went wide. She could hear the beep of the monitors, the rustle of sheets, her father's breathing. "Dad?" she said, aloud, her voice small and uncertain. Daniel's throat tightened. "I'm right here, sweetheart." Sophie smiled, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You sound like light." Vivian was standing in the doorway, watching. She had been there for every appointment, every consultation, every anxious moment. And when she saw Sophie hear her father's voice for the first time, she understood what Rachel had been fighting for. Not just safety, but connection. The ability to be heard and to hear, to participate fully in a world that had tried to leave them behind. 1 year after the arrest, the Seattle Brews Café had a new owner. Daniel had used part of the settlement money to buy it from the previous owner, who was ready to retire. He kept the name, but changed everything else. The staff was trained in basic sign language. The menu included Braille. There were quiet hours in the morning for people with sensory sensitivities. It wasn't just a coffee shop. It was a space where people who had been overlooked could finally feel welcome. On a bright Sunday morning, Vivian walked in. She wasn't wearing her hearing aids. She didn't need to hear. She wore a red dress, her hair down, and she looked more relaxed than Daniel had ever seen her. She approached the counter and signed. "Oat milk latte?" Danielle smiled. "Always." Sophie ran out from the back room, her cochlear implant visible behind her ear. She had learned to navigate both worlds now, signing when she wanted to, speaking when she needed to, never apologizing for either. She hugged Vivian tightly. The woman knelt down, returning the embrace with a fierceness that surprised even her. The three of them sat by the window, sunlight streaming through the glass, warming the table. Daniel poured coffee into 3 mugs. Sophie's was mostly milk, but she insisted on having one like the adults. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Some conversations happened in silence, some in words, some in the space between. Outside, the city moved on. Cars honked. People rushed past. The world kept turning. But inside the cafe, there was something that felt like peace. Not the kind that erased pain, but the kind that made room for healing. Vivian reached across the table and took Daniel's hand. He didn't pull away. Sophie grinned and put her small hand on top of theirs. "Listen with your heart," Sophie signed with her free hand. Daniel smiled. Rachel's words, living on through her daughter, through the foundation, through every person they helped find their voice. The steam rose from their cups, curling in the sunlight. Somewhere in the background, the espresso machine hissed. A song played softly on the speakers. Sophie laughed at something only she understood. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he could breathe. Vivian looked at him, and he looked back. No words. Just understanding. 2 people who had learned that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of listening. And sometimes, the loudest thing you could do was make space for someone else to be heard. The camera would pull back if this were a film. It would show the 3 of them framed by the window, the city behind them, the light catching on their faces. It would fade to black on their smiles, on the coffee cooling between them, on the promise that some endings were also beginnings. But this wasn't a film, this was a life. Messy and complicated, and never quite finished. There would be more struggles, more fights,